Hello, friends and fellow seekers of the good, true, beautiful. It's Mike here, and welcome to Sojournist Profiles. I have been wanting to have a conversation with my good friend Tim Pynes for literally years here, but finally we have the right opportunity, the right time, the right space for us to sit down and have a chat. Um, and that opportunity is the publication of Tim's book, Fly Fishing Through the Crazy, which we will talk about later on in our conversation. But you guys should know up top that Tim and I have been intimate allies, walking through life together, talking on the weekly, if not more, often for probably it's over 25 years. But not sure exactly. It's been a while. I know it's been at least that long and probably somewhat longer than that that we have actually been friends and walking together. And it all started, Tim, I think. I knew you initially as the I don't know if your title was executive pastor, but you were the pastor at the church I was attending in Denver. Met you then, and then at some point you had a wild hair idea to invite me to help you lead a midweek Bible study at the church, and then we did that for an entire year. So that's how we got to know each other that way, I guess. And then shortly thereafter, my father got sick, and he was moving toward his eventual passing away, and I ended up having to move back to Austin. All this that I just mentioned was happening in Denver, so I moved back to Austin. And Tim had the suggestion that we stay in touch by just connecting once a week and talking. And we did not, I don't think at the time thought this would be a long-term thing, but it has lasted for all 25 years that we have been friends. So that's a long time
It is a long time.
to,
It was so long ago. I had a full head of hair.
it's true.
Started.
It is true. Yeah. So I've had the privilege of being able to watch Tim, well, be amazing when I met him and then become more amazing as time goes on. And so he's one of those guys that you happen upon if you're lucky every so often in life who you wonder how the treasure of a guy like this could happen because people like Tim do not happen by accident. It's there's and we'll learn about this as we talk, but there's a definite intentionality to Tim that in the way that he has developed and worked his life and become the man that he is and doing the work that he does. So um, rather than me just talk about him, let's bring you in, Tim. And I think it might be helpful for folks like in our wide-ranging conversation. We'll talk about the work you do now with people and talk about your book. But it might be helpful just at first for folks to hear a bit about the all the different kinds of ways that you have led and you have been involved in people development. From the time, even before the time I met you, you were doing work with people. You had various hats you wore, various titles you wore. So maybe just give us a quick survey of all those different labels and titles and stuff.
Yeah. Trying to think where to begin. I went to seminary in the late 80s, back in the 20th century, and and really wanting to be a campus chaplain. And I did that um, for a couple years. And then I had a really good friend who has since passed away, who moved out to Durango, Colorado to start a ministry. And he invited me out there, and it felt like a really good fit with my gifts. And so I followed him. And then there were some issues in his life uh, that kind of caused the ministry to end. And so here I am with a seminary degree, not really sure what I was going to do. I got a job working at the domestic violence shelter in Durango, basically as a case manager, helping women who were living at the safe house get jobs. And that was part of my work. And the other part of my work was working at the homeless shelter there in Durango and working with the Southern Ute tribe. That's UTE, Southern Ute tribe in Southern Colorado, as a case manager with tribal members. And I love that work, but a friend of mine, and I did it for a couple of years, and that's where I feel like the people development really started, because I was working with people who really wanted mentors and they really wanted to learn and grow, and that was an aspect of my job. And so I felt like I was beginning to learn about myself, that I enjoyed that. People responded to that whenever I was in that kind of role. And I wasn't sure that I was ever going to be back in ministry. Um, but I knew that if there was ever an opportunity to do work that was about helping the church to grow, that that was sort of the sweet spot for me. But I was sort of waiting for the opportunity, and a friend of mine I had gone to seminary with had moved to Denver to help plant a church. And I went to one of the early meetings, and I just felt this was a place I wanted to invest my time. And it was a lot of people my age and a little bit older and some younger. So I moved to Denver to be involved in this church plant. There wasn't a position for me. I worked all kinds of odd jobs. I wasn't even bivocational initially. Eventually I became bivocational. And and as you said, as the church grew, I became the executive pastor, which in that role, it was about developing the staff, and individually as well as a team, making sure that people knew what their responsibilities were and helping to develop each staff member to do their job. And I liked all of that, but as the church got bigger, I felt like I was distanced. Other than those meetings with the individual staff members, I felt like I was a lot of what I was doing was sort of managing systems and processes and organizational kind of work that didn't feel as personal to me. And I realized over time that the work that I feel um, most drawn to is one-on-one, or at least smaller groups of people. I feel like any church, um, everything that church does in the course of a day nets out eventually to a life on life. That's where the rubber meets the road. And I felt like that was my sweet spot. So when I started to realize that I needed a different context in order to do the work that I felt most called to, um, I started doing CPE, which is clinical pastoral education, basically chaplain training. I started doing that, and I got trained as a spiritual director as part of my own process of discerning what the next steps were for me. And in the process of going through spiritual direction myself, I got trained through a year-long program to be a spiritual director. And so I have spent most of the last 25 years working primarily as a chaplain, a healthcare chaplain, either in a hospital context or a hospice, working for people who have received a terminal diagnosis. A hospice is a philosophy, it can be a place, but it's also a diagnosis that a doctor has to write, saying that if things continue the way that they are currently, this person is likely to die within the next 6 months. So when I say I work for a hospice, that means that I would go wherever the person lives, whether that be a private home or a nursing home, a memory care unit, something like that. Currently, I work for a hospice mainly as a bereavement coordinator. So once a hospice patient dies, Um, in the Medicare determined that a person when a person on hospice dies, the team all moves on and continues to work with other patients, but the family's left. And so it's a wonderful benefit that our tax dollars help pay for, the hospice benefit. Each hospice has to have a bereavement coordinator to walk with the family for the next 13 months. And the reason it's 13 months is because they know in that 13 months, there's going to be a birthday, there's going to be anniversaries, there's going to be holidays, and there's going to be the anniversary of the death of the patient. And so most of my work now for the hospice is doing that work. And I feel like that's something that I'm really good at and that I enjoy. It can be intense, but it's very rewarding. And then, as I said, I used to work for hospitals at different times. I haven't worked for a hospital since the second year of the pandemic. I really felt burnt out from the COVID pandemic, and that's when I switched back fully to working for a hospice. Then the other part of my work that I do is I have my own practice as a spiritual director. That can be kind of confusing for people as to what that is, but a lot of it's, I call it, there's a Celtic term called Anam Cara, which means soul friend. A lot of that is just coming alongside people who are in some place in their own spiritual growth where they might feel they've plateaued or they feel stuck or they sense the relationship with God, with Jesus has changed, and maybe they've reached a new level of growth and it's disorienting, and they just need another set of eyes and ears, somebody to help them to see what's maybe hard for them to see. um, I feel like that's the work that I most enjoy. um, People always, the clients that I have, they come with something that they're wanting to work on, to focus on. But in addition to whatever that is, I have this sort of sub goal, if you will, that I'm thinking about. And that is, does this person have an intimate relationship with God, with Jesus? And I feel like that's the thing I'm most passionate about. That is available to us. Many of us have been told that that was something that was available, but we're never taught that. And what does that mean? What does that look like? Um, a lot of people that I have walked with over the years would say, I checked the box. Yes, I have a personal relationship, but they wouldn't define that relationship as intimate. And that breaks my heart. That's
Mm.
something that I feel uh, is wrong. There's something wrong when somebody does everything that they were asked to do, and through no fault of their own, they wouldn't define that relationship as intimate. So that's a really long answer to your question, but that leads us up to present day, I guess, in terms of what I'm doing now.
Yeah, and I want to, that's a great place to jump off to talk about the work that you do. But I will just point out for folks, and this is part of the reason why uh, I have I have watched you be such a rich resource for people, because you have this multi-layered depth of pastoral training, working with people in crisis, like early on with there in Durango, but then working in a pastoral setting in a church, developing people there, working with leadership, developing people in leadership context, moving into both hospice and spiritual direction, which we'll talk about a lot more, but working with people as they're the dying, people who are dying in the families, the bereaved, all of that, part of your bread and butter, working with people who are in a spiritual desert, who feel disconnected from spirit, from themselves, from the divine in all kinds of different ways. Just years, decades, and decades of experience in the multiplicity of all of these different aspects of the of what it means to be human and of our human journey. And it's just a rare thing to have a guide an Anam Cara, a soul friend who actually has this kind of breadth of experience. And so that's the thing I think I want that I it's hard for people to just get on a piece of paper to see on a resume. But anyone who sits down with you very quickly realizes um, that they're not sitting down with uh, what is that line from Gandalf where he says to what he says to Frodo?
Do not think me a conjurer of cheap tricks.
That's it. Yeah. Yes. Do not think me a conjurer of cheap tricks. That you are not a conjurer of cheap tricks. People sit down with you and something real is about to happen because of that, right? Um, and so I want to swing back around to what you said earlier about the thing that breaks your heart about people that do not have a connection with God or with the divine. They think perhaps that's not allowed or that that's not possible, and that much of your work is centered or focused on healing that rift or bridging that gap. Uh, this quote, I know Father Greg Boyle is one of your favorites, and he has written before a couple of things about this where he says, we settle for a partial God when we should hold out for the God we actually have. And he goes on to say, the good news is that the God we most deeply want is the God that we actually have. But the God that we fear is, in fact, this partial God that we've settled for. When God actually looks at us and is ecstatic, the actual God loves the sound of our voices, thinks that all of us are a magnificent work of art, but we settle for this lesser God, this partial God, this puny God, this more realistic God than the God we actually have. Um, and so I'm curious, like how when people come to you, here's what I make up. The people come to you with an ache and a longing, or something's not right, something's missing, and they probably typically think they're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
So what happens then? Like, what do you do at that point with someone that you're working with?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to say that, what I believe the place that I begin from is that individual, all of us really are within the circle of God's love. And in fact, it's not really a circle. There are no edges to it. We are always in that place of God's love. We might not even be aware of that. The psalmist says, where can I go to get away from that? I can't. There's nowhere that I can go. So I think I always begin from that place of believing that um, that's true. Um, but people, through no fault of their own, may not be living in that awareness. There's a phrase I heard years ago that I think about a lot. Standing neck deep in a river, in the river of love, and dying of thirst. Um, so there's an awareness of that intellectually, cognitively, but then there's an awareness of it that kind of permeates us. The other thing that I would say that I would begin with is that for those of us who would use words like, I have this relationship with God, with Jesus, with the divine. Um, if that's the case, we didn't initiate that. And so all of the burden, all of the onus is not on our shoulders to maintain that. We didn't initiate it, we received it. We became aware that we were standing neck deep in the river of love and dying of thirst, and decided to fully embrace and accept that reality of that we're always in the presence of God's love. It's always flowing towards us. So that's where I begin. Often, what I would say is that a lot of people, um, many people, when they come to me, they have something that they're wanting to focus on, but I'm sort of paying attention to that. Do they know that? Is that are they living in that reality? Many people feel that all of the burden is on them. It is a relationship, so it's collaborative. There is a reciprocity to it, but the ultimate burden of that is not on them any more than my two daughters feel that the relationship they have with me is all on them, and it's up to them to always make sure that that relationship is in a good place. So I begin from that place, and um, I think the other thing I would say is that God is always about the work of redemption and maturation. God wants us to be more intimate. God wants us to be more united. The goal is intimacy and union. Um, and so God's always about that work, but it's usually at a level below our consciousness. We might be aware of something that God is doing in our life right now, but it's usually at some point later in the future down the road, we look back and go, oh, now I see that how God used that situation and this situation and that bad news and this good news and all those kinds of things that we thought were might have just been random events. God uses that to help us grow up because God wants to give us more. God wants to be more intimate, and in order to do that, um, our hearts need to be enlarged to receive more. So just to kind of give a quick example of that, the conversations I have now with my almost 23-year-old daughter, she'll be 23 in a couple weeks, are very different now than they were when she was 6, right?
Sure.
Because I can share more of me with her because developmentally she's more mature. So God is always about that work of maturation because God wants to be more united, wants there to be more intimacy. So I'm paying attention to that in the people that I work with to see if that's something that they're even aware of. Is that something that they're hindering? I just said that God is always about that work of redemption and maturation. We can collaborate that. We can be completely unaware of it, or we can also thwart it. We can also, God's not going to force us to do anything. God will invite us, but we can thwart that in in ways that we might not even be aware that we're doing. Um, so all that to say that I'm paying attention to that, and I'm also paying attention to people's hunger, because we all have hunger for more wholeness, and really the work that I do. A friend named this for me years ago. Is I don't say this a lot because it can be confusing for people, but really I see my work as wholenessing. I'm helping people to become more whole in who God has created them to be. So yeah, um, that's really what I'm focusing on. There is always sort of the thing that people want to work on, and I see my work holistically. So it's sort of like a child's mobile hanging above their crib. If you go up and touch one of the pieces hanging down, the whole thing moves. It's all interrelated. So they come to me with whatever they want to focus on. And at the same time, I'm trying to help them to pay more attention to their life. I'm trying to help them to be more aware, more conscious, to help them to have eyes to see, to notice things. You remember the video that was real popular a decade ago? People were passing the basketball around, and somebody in a bear suit or gorilla suit moonwalks right through it.
Yeah.
And how everybody the first time didn't see that. And it's because that's not something we were looking for.
Right.
So I believe that God is always at work in our lives. Like I said, a lot of that is below the level of consciousness, but we can also learn to look for those things. And if we, like the Bible says, seek and you will find. So what you're seeking, you will find, including things that you may not be helpful for you.
Right.
So what I'm trying to do is to notice where they're taking their hunger and trying to nudge them towards being more of a active participant in helping that relationship to become more intimate.
Yeah. So wild because like you and I often talk about speaking of the heartbreak that this, you look out on the world, look at the people, especially in our culture right now, with how divisive it is, how much anger is present, how much, I suppose, lack of, we could say self-awareness, but certainly lack of noticing, and paying attention to things is present. And I suppose where I'm kind of going with this is curious about what what breaks your heart the most, I suppose, when you look out at the world and where people are at, um, and what your hope is, Like, I mean, you have a greatest hope for your spiritual direction clients, hope for them as they come to work for you, um, come work with you. But it feels like all of this is part of this greater work of what we're trying to see happen within our society, within the lives of people that are around us every day. It's also part of why I think, what you wrote about in Fly Fishing Through the Crazy, which is using something as beautiful and elegant as fly fishing as a gateway into awakening, into transforming. So, uh, when I'm landing the plane here, but it's really just a question. I suppose I'm curious about what it is that you are hoping for the most. Um, uh, maybe I'll put it this way, what is the person you most want to work with? Like when the kind of person that you would love to see walk through your door, and sit down with you and have a conversation. Uh, yeah, I'll leave it there and see where you take that.
Yeah, what immediately comes to mind is the name of that song by U2. I still haven't found what I'm looking for. You know, somebody for whom they haven't stopped growing, they haven't stopped seeking and searching and wanting to, you know, be experience greater intimacy with God. I can remember sitting in a seminary class in my fourth year of seminary. I did a master's program that was 4 years, and I'm in a systematic theology class, and we're reading. Very helpful, wonderful class, wonderful professor. But my professor had begun the class with a devotion where he quoted some hero of the faith, some saint, Saint Francis or you know Teresa of Avila. I forget who it was, but I remember sitting there. Then he began to lecture about some element of theology, and I remember thinking, this isn't going to get me to the place that the person that was quoted got to. More knowledge wasn't going to get me there. And so for me, it has been a lifetime of seeking, of wanting to continue to grow, of wanting more and more. If there are more levels, more more depth of intimacy that I can have with the divine, then that becomes the most important thing. And so, how do I do that? Um, what breaks my heart is when we've since COVID, we've come through a season where there are, the phrase people have deconstructed, or there's the nuns where they don't identify with any church anymore. And all of that has sort of been categorized and defined as bad. And what I feel like is that's actually really good that people came to a place of realizing that something was flawed or something wasn't working anymore. That it's not optional to not have hunger. We are organic beings. We are designed to grow. Change is a part of that. And if you're not growing, then you're probably dead. So for me, that wasn't a big red flag. For me, that was no, the people are saying that there's something flawed with this system they were in. So a lot of people decided that to not be a part of whatever that system was anymore. And what I applaud is their their recognition of that, and that they weren't going to let the hunger die. Although I think some people kind of gave up and have taken their hunger somewhere else. So what breaks my heart is when people um, suppress what that hunger for intimacy, for that hunger for growth, for the wholenessing that I talked about before. There's this quote by Soren Kierkegaard that I think about a lot. And the quote is, people settle for a level of despair they can tolerate and call it happiness. And I witnessed that a lot. Um, there are lots of stories of people in the Bible who, well, to use the phrase that was used with Moses when he saw the burning bush. You've written a book, many books. I've written a book. There's not a single word in my book that I didn't intentionally place there. And the writer um, put in the phrase that Moses turned aside. And that wasn't just sort of accidental. That's an important element in that story where Moses had to go take a look. Um, that's like pausing and taking a look at our own life or the life of somebody else and going, what's really going on here? So there's lots of stories like that. The one of Jesus where he sees that Zacchaeus has climbed the tree, and it's like, there's hunger. There's somebody who's actively living out that hunger that they feel. So of course he wants to go have dinner at Zacchaeus's house because that's somebody that has not turned that part off.
Mhm.
Um, there's this other quote by C.S. Lewis where he says, "It would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. We are far too easily pleased." So what breaks my heart is when people have taken that hunger for what is about greater life with the divine, that wholeness that I talked about before, and they settle for a level of despair, just sort of managing life. I don't want too many ups, I don't want too many downs, just kind of even keel. And that hunger that is there that may have caused that wasn't being addressed, that may have caused them to leave the church or kind of give up. This doesn't work. Um, to not go, well, that system doesn't work, but I'm going to continue to pursue the real. Uh, that's what breaks my heart. There's that passage for anybody who's spent any time in a more evangelical church. There's a hymn that was often sung based on the Psalm 42:1, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul pants after you. He's not talking about drinking water. He's not talking about physical thirst. So my soul pants. He's talking about, I'm hungry for you. I'm thirsty for you at the level of my soul. And so part of what I try to do in my work is to help people to become aware that that's there. More than likely, they're taking it to these places that what C.S. Lewis calls less wild lovers, taking it to places that can never really satisfy that. So that's what breaks my heart. But when I have somebody show up who might who would echo the words of the U2 song, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. I'm still hungry. I still experience that thirst. It hasn't been fully satisfied yet. That's when I feel that would be my ideal person that I would want to work for.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. Yeah, me too. Like in my work as well, same. People that are actually interested in growing, interested in taking the next step, willing to risk,
Yeah.
um, uh, living for a deeper connection and a deeper life, and moving toward wholeness, as you say. So interesting, when we talk about less wild lovers, uh, how I remember back in the day when U2 first came out with that song. I still haven't found what I'm looking for. There was a massive pushback in the evangelical church because they were like, this proves that Bono and crew are not Christian
Yeah.
because surely they would have found what they're looking for. They would have had the right answer by now if that were the case. And just a massive exercise in missing the point. But it does speak to one of the less wild lovers that I've noticed a lot of people, many, many people live with as their lover is actually fear or safety or security. Like what is the least risky way that I can be in the world? What is the most emotionally safe way that I can travel through this life? And finding whatever system they can be in that will actually reinforce or cause them to feel the most secure. Now, that's not be the most secure, feel the most secure, which is an interesting and powerful distinction. And I think, like you, what I'm hearing you say is it really is those people who have recognized that that is a false lover. I think it's Helen Keller that actually said, I can't remember the exact quote, but like that kind of seeking after safety is an illusion, and you have to grab life with both hands. And this is a woman who couldn't see or hear, who is saying this. But really, that idea of having a hunger for the real and pursuing the real and recognizing that there is a possibility for there to be a rich, full life for me, for you, for whoever it is that's walking through your door to sit down and have a conversation with you. And what I love about the work that you do is that most people, I would say probably most people that have recognized that are then kind of left with an open-ended question. Well, okay, I'm hungry. Where's the food?
Yeah.
And you have this wealth of history, wealth of depth of your own seeking, your own study that really is like uh, you're the water, you're the wayfinder in the desert, you're the dude who knows where the wells are, like all that. So yeah, I can really help them find it. What I think is so interesting though, and I don't know if you want to speak to this or not, but you really can't come into those conversations and say, well, here's your four-step plan for finding your, you
Yeah.
know, because that's not how it works. It's much more of a self process of self-discovery and self-transformation. You have to actually take the journey yourself. And so like you say, you used the word nudge earlier. Like there is a kind of way that you can see probably where the well is and where they are, kind of what has to happen, but you can't sort of hand them the four-step plan to get to the well. It's more just nudge their point their eyes in a certain direction, ask a certain question, awaken them to a certain way of thinking or possibility. Am I right? Am I kind of hitting the target there as I say that?
Yeah, no, no, you're right on. This isn't there isn't a technique. There aren't techniques. It's about walking with people. Um, but yeah, you're saying it very well. You're reminding me of the quote of the poet Mary Oliver, who said, "Attention is the beginning of devotion." And which leads me to another quote by, I believe it was Paula Darcy, who's an author, who said, God comes to us disguised as our life or our lives. And so then the Quaker writer, Parker Palmer, in response to that quote, said, let your life speak. So I don't, I would never blame anybody for wanting to, I understand that, of wanting to just kind of not rock the boat, don't risk too much. This is too hard. Life is hard, and God is hard to appropriate at times. Um, we weren't, for many of us, we weren't taught how to experience God. We were taught to be dutiful. We were taught to show up. We were taught to serve. We were taught a lot of those kinds of things that we did. It was the gospel of knowledge and duty, and we did that really well. But that didn't lead us to the intimacy that I'm talking about. Um, so, yeah, it's about paying attention. It's about waking up. It's about choosing to, uh, yeah, to pay. That's the beginning of it. Like Mary
Hmm.
said, it's about beginning to pay attention. There's this idea that I love on the long distance trails that we have in this country, like the Appalachian Trail, the Continental Divide Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail. There's this idea of trail magic and how you're just putting in your miles, man. You're just, most of the time, you're just showing up and putting in the miles. But occasionally, there's trail magic. And that might be something like water, that a cache of water that people put out in a stretch where there's not much water to be found. Um, but it also might be something, maybe you love hummingbirds, and one day a hummingbird comes and while you're taking a break and hovers right in front of your eyes for a few minutes. Or maybe you happen to come upon a wildflower meadow and something about that really touches your heart. Or maybe you round a corner and there's this incredible vista where the light's coming through a certain way. And all of that matters. All of that is evidence of God's love for us. Um, that God created this beauty as a way of sort of wooing us, reminding us that we are within that circle, endless circle of God's love. But it's about paying attention, and our culture, the world, the systems of this world are about lulling us into kind of this state of hypnosis where it's just about survival mode. And that's why Jesus is pretty regularly asks things like, uh, or says things like, for those who have ears to hear, for those who have eyes to see. He's basically saying, for those of you who are awake, for those of you who are conscious, um, because he knows, and he's not, uh, he's never angry at anyone for being that. He understands that, but he says that every now and then as a kind of a way to say, are you
Hmm.
conscious? Are you able to hear this? Are you able to see this? And what I have to offer didn't come magically on my own. I've had my own mentors and spiritual directors. Still to this day, of course, I'm 62 now. I can't envision a time in my life where I'm not going to have my own soul friends
Hmm.
that are helping to see what's happening in my own life. Um, so anyway, I think hopefully I answered some of your question in there.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a good segue to like the idea of being awake. Um, and segueing to your book, Fly Fishing for the Crazy. And I basically, before we close out, I'd like to talk for a few minutes about the book and then talk about how people can reach out to you. Because I know that anybody who wants to can just set up a free conversation to just touch base, kind of talk about their situation and see if working with you is something they want to do. So it's
Yeah.
definitely or that you want to do with them. So something that definitely worth taking advantage of. But this book, Fly Fishing Through the Crazy, just recently came out, and I was privileged to be to be involved in some small way in the writing of it, and I loved the premise of the book, and even the title references what happened during the madness of COVID. And um, during that time, I know because I was walking with you through it, there was a period of time where you felt pulled to work in an emergency room in the hospital for a long time during the height of COVID, when it was at its worst and we didn't understand the disease whenever nearly as much as we do now, when people were going on ventilators and not coming off of them, when families were prohibited from being with their loved ones when they were in the hospital, and you in the madness of that emergency room setting as a hospice chaplain, um, and then finding the need for uh, solace, for recovery, for processing through the trauma, the secondary trauma of being in that space, and fly fishing being a way that you could access that sort of solace. But I think so that's like the baseline. But then the deeper part of the book that I think speaks to is timeless, is the thing we've been talking about in the whole conversation of sort of the madness of life, or the frenzy of life, or the kind of unconsciousness of life, and all that hypnosis, being in that state of hypnosis that you mentioned, is just sort of normative to the systems of the world, and finding a way to step out of that into a place of paying attention and noticing, and in that process coming awake, is just part of what this book is actually about. Like, it is actually what it's doing. And you do it by just telling stories about your own experience through those days. So um, love that. I mean, I've kind of just taken a stab at describing it, but do you think you would add or to that description of what the book is about, or your writing of it, that you want to make sure people know about?
Yeah, I think you described it really well. As you were talking, I was reminded of the opening scene of The Matrix, where Neo is sleeping like on his desk or maybe his keyboard, and remember the words
Yeah,
come out on the screen that say "wake up."
yeah.
And that whole movie is about him waking up. But that's sort of an aside. Yeah, the book, I had been working in a hospital that I'd worked for a hospital that was a level 4 trauma center. So it's kind of like the DEF CON, where the lower the number, the more severe. So a level 4 trauma center means you don't get all the really, really bad stuff. The the worst stuff goes to a level 1 or 2 or 3. I had worked at a level 4 hospital. I still had to respond to all the traumas in the emergency department, and often they were pretty horrific. Sometimes they were pretty horrific, and we would life flight people to one of the level 1 or 2 trauma hospitals. Um, but then at some point, but then I ended up working at a hospital that was a level 2, I think, and they had changed right before I started working for them, and so I'm seeing a lot worse stuff
Hmm.
in that lower level trauma hospital. And as a chaplain, I was having to respond to all these traumas whenever I was working. And as a chaplain, being around that much trauma, what I was experiencing was, uh, and had experienced even before, was a lot of secondary and vicarious trauma. Secondary trauma is what we all experience, those of us who watch 9/11 on TV. We weren't there experiencing it in person. That's level 1 trauma. We were experiencing secondary trauma, which is uh, witnessing it, but kind of removed. And then vicarious trauma is when somebody starts telling you a horrible story of some kind of abuse or some horrific accident or something, and you're not experiencing it, but just hearing it makes you feel less safe.
Hmm.
It just sort of touches on some fear that you have. So I had experienced a lot of that over the years, responding to. traumas in the emergency department. And so when I got to this new hospital that was a higher level of trauma, I realized pretty quickly that I need a way to sort of counteract the things that this secondary and vicarious trauma that I was feeling all the time. You know, you can only see so, you know, so many horrific things, somebody severely burned or something like that without that messing with you. So I started to experience the effect. I started experiencing the PTSD as a result of the cumulative effect of all of that. And then you add in the pandemic and COVID and the intensity of that. And I realized I better have some kind of practice that helps me to center and to recharge, you know, self-care. I better have something like that or I'm not going to make it. You know, definitely not going to be able to do this for the rest of my career. So I have been fishing all my life. Fly fishing is something that it's slower. It's a slow activity. You can't move fast or you'll scare the fish. In order to cast the fly rod, there's a rhythm to it. There's a beauty to it. If you've seen the movie A River Runs Through It, you've witnessed some of that. There's a saying that trout live only in beautiful places. That's mostly true. Um, so the idea of being out in beauty and wildness and nature historically has always been healing for me. So I decided I'm gonna make that a practice that helps me to be able to continue to do this work. It's sort of the counterpoint to what I was experiencing. And so there's an essay in the book that the title comes from, Fly Fishing Through the Crazy, that is about that time when COVID started and sort of how I was experiencing it. And it kind of flashes back and forth from working in the hospital and what I was experiencing there to being on a trout stream and how healing that was. But also the when the pandemic started, I immediately had to isolate from my own family. They lived in one part of the house and I lived in the other. And if I wasn't at the hospital, I was in or initially being able to fish a little bit until the shutdown came. I was in my own room by myself. And the PTSD at times was really bad. I would feel this level of terror that I could intellectually go, dude, Tim, what, you know, you're fine. You're in your own room. You're okay. Intellectually, I could say that to myself, but emotionally, I felt flooded with this kind of feeling of terror and display. And when I was like, I got to figure out something that I can do while I'm in isolation here, I wanted to I wanted to write down the story of the first time I went fishing when my uncle took me when my father was in Vietnam in 1969. And so I wrote that essay, never intending to write any more than that. But in the process of writing that essay, I noticed that it had a similar effect on me that the fly fishing did. I was able to get into a state of flow. I was able to get into a kind of hyper focused place and it calmed my mind. And so the book really came out of that. And fly fishing is the context for the book, or fishing's the context for the book. But it's really, for me, a book about how wildness and beauty and nature uh, was healing to me at a time when I was having a hard time finding that place of peace within me that normally I can access pretty easily.
Yes. Yeah, it's such a great meditative read. It's also just a really interesting read because you tell stories in here of the many different adventures you've been on, fly fishing and other kinds of fishing as well. Just some beautiful parts of the country, some beautiful places you've been, and you do a great job of just describing those locations. So just on the pure storytelling level, it's a great read. But I mean, what you get for the price of entry are these deeper stories of the transcendent and the, like you said, the capacity to awaken, to find solace, to find the healing that we're all looking for all the time when we step outside of the office and look up at the clouds, or when we try to go for a walk at lunch, or whenever we're doing anything like that, we're reaching for something. And that's what this book is really about, is how do you get out of the crazy to
Yeah,
touch the real? And interestingly enough, that's what your work is about. Like in a basic way too, is how do you get out of the crazy and get in touch with the real and make that your life, over time. So speaking of, how do people find you? Like if they wanted to come and set up a sample call with you, how does that happen?
yeah, yeah. I have a website. It's my name, Tim Pynes, and that's Pynes. It's just timpines.com. There's a place on there where people can click a link to request a 30-minute conversation for me. It's it's real low key. All I'm doing is kind of getting to hear why the person wants to begin this conversation with me, what they're hoping for, what their desire.
Mm.
Um, and some of that I asked them to fill out in a little online form before we even talk, just to kind of give me a sense of where they're coming from. But then, yeah, we have a 30-minute conversation that allows them to kind of get to hear from me and tell me what they're thinking, and then I get to hear from them and decide. Both get to decide if it feels like a good fit. And so people can go to that site and request that. And then also my email address is listed on the site if people have other questions they want to ask before they request a 30-minute conversation.
Great. And then can people also find your book at the same site, or where else would
Yeah,
they
there's
look
a
for
link
this?
to it on my website, but they can also just go to Amazon. It's
Okay.
available on Amazon and Kindle, and the paperback that you have there. It's a quick read. You could probably read it in 3 or 4 hours. I am going to create an audiobook version that's on the to-do list, but
Yeah.
that'll come out in the next 2 or 3 months.
Right. Great. Yeah. It is a quick read, although I would recommend savoring it, and taking it in small chunks just because it's kind of great for reading, almost like you would going on a fly fishing trip. Like the reading it has the effect of causing you to slow down. So, which is, I suppose, what you really want to see happen,
Yeah,
in that, which is
definitely.
good. Well, so before we close out, I give you the last word. If there's anything else you wanted to share or speak to from our conversation, or something we didn't address before we sign off today.
Yeah, I just I think I would just encourage people to connect to their hunger and to realize that that's ingrained in us, and to not try to satisfy it with things that will never really satisfy it. And if you contact me and we have a conversation and it doesn't feel like I'm a good fit, um, I can refer people. I have a whole bunch of other people that I could refer them to.
Yeah.
Don't don't um yeah, don't end the desire and search for continued wholeness and growth. That is available. There is way more intimacy that all of us can experience. Um, so I would encourage people to continue to seek and pursue um, greater and greater levels of intimacy and wholeness with the divine, with
Uh,
God.
yeah, man, I so echo that. Do not settle for less wild lovers. Your heart is worth so much more than that. Your hunger is worth so much more than that. So, yeah,
That part
take,
that Father Greg Boyle you mentioned at the beginning, the partial God.
yeah, the partial God. Yeah. So yeah, take the shot, take the risk, step out. I mean, what you're risking is a conversation.
Yeah,
That's it. And then see where that could go. But it could actually awaken an entirely different way of being in the world, to you. So, thanks, buddy. So good to hang with you for this time.
yeah. Thank you. This was great. I enjoyed, as I always do, having a conversation with you.
Yeah, yeah, likewise. Good.